I believe in the idea of like water reflects face to face, so too the human heart to another heart. And that's how I live my life. I generally feel like I try to be kind. I don't live with any fear because I feel like I approach people from an open place. And in general, always really people respond in kind. So I have a sort of fundamentally optimistic sense about the world. And I feel like we require that, even if it's not true, we have to tell ourselves that it's true because it's the only basis on which we give ourselves the strength to be able to do any good.
So, Hayyim Rothman, very briefly, who are you?
I don't know how to answer that. I don't know what you want.
Insofar as the context of this conversation and academia is concerned, I'm not asking an existential question. Don't worry.
I am a scholar of modern Jewish thought. I focus on political theology generally and Jewish anarchist theology in specific. I am the author of a book called No Masters But God, Portraits of Anarcho-Judaism.
And now I want people to buy the book, right?
No one doesn't buy it. It's too expensive right now. In another 8 months or so, it should come out in paperback.
Do you want to show us the camera and just tell us very quickly what it is and why people should buy it when it comes out in paperback?
When it comes out in paperback, this is way too expensive now. But when it comes out in paperback, you should buy my book. It's called No Masters But God, Portraits of Anarcho-Judaism. And in short, what I try to do is talk about first the historical origins of this modern train of Jewish political theology, and then go through some of the more important promoters of an interface between anarchist ways of thinking and Jewish theological ways of thinking.
Nice. I'm actually just myself. I just want to have a quick look at the table of content. That's the first thing I check in the book. What would be actually quite fun for me, and probably for some of the audience too, is if you could just give us a brief sort of historical sketch of anarchism as a thought movement, with like its major moments and thinkers. If that's something that you'd be willing to share, that would be very fun. And that way we can like situate the conversation in a historical context.
So I don't feel like I can give like a full like historical breakdown.
No. Don't try to be comprehensive. Just like the high.
Okay, so like
the big names.
Big names. So the term anarchism or anarchist was coined by Pierre Joseph Proudhon, who was a Frenchman, and he sort of as I said, he coined the term. He was sort of the initiator of this sort of anti-governmental notion of somewhat socialist vision. And from him forward, the anarchism and forms of socialism or communism didn't really break until quite late in the game. So another major figure is Mikhail Bakunin, who was a Russian radical, and under his leadership is when anarchism broke from sort of the broader socialist movement that at that point was dominated by Marx. Other important thinkers are, as I mentioned, Kropotkin earlier. He's a proponent of anarcho-communism, which was very influential in Jewish circles during his day. So a lot of the major anarchist periodicals, Yiddish language anarchist periodicals, do a lot of translation work of bringing Kropotkin to a Yiddish-speaking and Yiddish-reading audience. And I think a big part of that is that unlike Bakunin, who was blatantly anti-Semitic and really didn't have a great reception for that reason among Jewish circles. Kropotkin was, I wouldn't say philo-Semitic, but he had a good relationship with the Jewish community, and there's a couple instances in his memoirs where he mentions his gratitude for certain. There's a section where he talks about how a Jewish trader helped steal him across the border when he was he was being chased by the authorities. So he didn't forget that, and that had an impact on his relationship with the Jewish community. So Kropotkin was important. Tolstoy, I think, especially for the train of anarchist thought that I specifically look at, was enormously important, specifically because he was the first major proponent of a theological foundation for anarchist thought. So he met Proudhon, for example. He read Proudhon's work, but when you look at books like The Kingdom of God, which is one of his later texts, and most of his nonfiction essays, he is really developing a way of thinking about society and politics that grows naturally out of his reading of scripture. And in his case, it was the Gospels, and almost specifically contrary to his view of the Old Testament or the Torah. But the idea stuck that there was a way of thinking theologically that was intrinsically political and also crossed paths in many important ways with an important trend of radical thought of the late 19th and early 20th century, namely anarchism. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. What's happening here is interesting because the intention is to talk eventually about mystical anarchism, or the sort of the overlap between mysticism and anarchism. And now we've opened up the can of worms, which is anarchism and rationalism. And it might be an interesting triangulation. Most people might not think automatically to associate either one of these categories with either, but mysticism and rationalism aren't usually overlapped either. Sometimes they're seen as antinomies, whether that's correct or incorrect. So I'd be curious to know, how does this tradition grow out of Spinoza's rationalism? And then how do we get from a, let's say, rationalist anarchism to a mystical anarchism?
Well, first of all, I guess I would... I don't agree that rationalism and mysticism are in conflict with one another. I think that many of the great medieval mystics were self-consciously rationalists. And I think that the question is, which kind of rationalism are we talking about? So for sort of the Neoplatonized medieval Aristotelianism that viewed God as emanating reason that eventually congealed into the world that we live in. So it was eminently rational. The world is made up of congealed thoughts, God's congealed thoughts. And it was also mystical because the idea was, if the world is composed of God's congealed thoughts, then we can trace those thoughts backwards until we get back to the source of those thoughts. So yeah, like on that ground, I just fundamentally disagree that that rationalism and mysticism are contrary to one another. I think that at most you'd have to say, well, which rationalism?
Right. No, I appreciate that nuance, and I think I would agree, and perhaps many of the audience would agree as well. What's happening in Spinoza's rationalism that lent itself to anarchism? So I wrote my dissertation on Spinoza.
Yeah. And So the title of that dissertation was Anarchism Out of the Sources of Spinozism.
Okay.
Reasons, Rebellion, Anarchism Out of the Sources of Spinozism.
Reasons, rebellion, like
Yes.
the rebellion of reason.
Because Spinoza is a rationalist, and there's a rebellious character to his thought. And my claim in the dissertation was that there are things relevant to anarchist thought that are to be drawn from Spinoza's political and theological writings.
Yeah, I was curious to know what exactly in Spinoza's thought they're engaging with.
So for Spinoza, we tend to talk about a parallelism, which is a word that I used earlier, between thought and extension. So, and by extension, roughly speaking, we're talking about the material things, although for Spinoza that's a little bit more complicated and we don't need to get into that. But thought and extension is parallel to one another, but really it's much... A parallelism is an easy way to discuss it, but it's not really a good description of what Spinoza is actually thinking. So for him, the fundamental reality is what he calls a substance, and he identifies substance with God. And the way that he sets up the infrastructure of the divine is that he views God as having attributes, and those attributes are what the medievals would have called essential attributes. So in contrast to a Maimonides who said God does not have essential attributes, he just has things that we describe him as, but himself is ultimately simple. For Spinoza, God is entirely composed of attributes. And the two attributes, at least that we have access to, and it's a dispute in Spinoza scholarship as to whether Spinoza says God actually has infinite attributes or has infinite attributes, and by infinity I mean all of the possible attributes, and there happens to be only two possible attributes. So that's a whole...
Carl Jasper's kind of riffs on that.
Yeah, it's a whole dispute. Yeah. But for our purposes, all that matters is thought and extension for him. But what makes an attribute is that it can fully circumscribe substance. So when we speak of the attribute of thought, what we mean is thought insofar as it is, substance insofar as it is thought. When we speak about extension, we mean substance insofar as it is conceived under the attribute of extension, which means that it's not that there is thought and there is extension. It means that there's substance, and substance can be conceived either from the vantage point of thought or from the vantage point of extension. But in point of fact, they're not differentiated. They're differentiated because that's how they have to be conceived in order to conceive substance through that lens. So I really strongly push against efforts to fit Spinoza into the Kabbalistic tradition, for example. Number one, because he explicitly discusses Kabbalah in a couple different sections of his corpus of writings, and it's never positive. And second, because the methodology that you come across in Kabbalistic writings is just very different in terms of the way that it's trying to conceive of the divine. Whereas, let's say in the fifth book of the Ethics, when Spinoza is talking about experientially, in a way, so how does one achieve the highest form of knowledge, an intuitive grasp of the divine, which functions as a sort of mystical experience because it's going beyond it's situating the individual within the context of eternity. And I would describe that as a mystical discussion, but it's happening within a strictly rationalistic framework. He's talking about intuitive knowledge. But for him, intuitive knowledge has a fundamentally experiential component. It's just a component that goes beyond our individual being. So the intersection of mysticism and rationalism for Spinoza really happens in that section of the ethics, where the intuitive knowledge of God binds the finite individual with substance by the individual seeing themselves as now situated within the context of the absolute. But where that gets more into the realm of mysticisms that are more familiar to us is after Spinoza dies, one of the major Spinoza revivals is after Mendelssohn and Jacobi have their dispute. So this is also like during the generation of Kant, and the post-Kantian generation is trying to sort of come to terms with Kant, come to terms with critical philosophy, and somehow come at the same time resituate it in the context of the dogmatic philosophy that preceded Kant. And one of the ways that they do that is through the creation of German idealism. And German idealism always sort of dances between philosophy and theology, between philosophy and mysticism, and it depends on where you're looking exactly. But the use of Spinoza in this context is very much tinged with mystical elements, because what they're trying to accomplish is finding some way to overcome the subject-object division in the world. And for them, Spinoza is a really important resource, because that fundamentally that's the ultimate experience that Spinoza is trying to get you to in the ethics. That's bliss. So whereas, say, for Kant, you have an individual who's conscious of their own phenomenal experience of the world, and then there's the noumenal world that we know nothing about. So there's this sort of absolute break between the phenomenal and the noumenal. To one extent or another, what the German idealists are trying to do is to try and break down that division and reintegrate the phenomenal subject into an objective world that's filled with substantial things, or God for Spinoza. So, yeah.
And they're doing that with Spinoza.
They're drawing on Spinoza. Yeah. So, but they're not, I would say that they are inspired students of Spinoza, but not faithful students of Spinoza.
So this is less Spinoza as anarchist. This is Spinoza as mystic.
This is Spinoza as mystic. The Spinoza as anarchist. So one of the... So if you... So to get to the anarchist part, so I have my own take on that, which has to do with like a very specific reading of certain passages in the ethics, which I really don't think, like, it's just not going to be helpful for this discussion because it's too technical. But from a historical standpoint, you have to look at what was the experience for people of reading a book like the Theological Political Treatise. Spinoza's Theological Political Treatise. So in that book, one of the things that he does is attack scripture as either a historical authority or a political authority. And in doing so, he ends up coming up with his own sort of rationalist religious credo that is more or less indexable to things that he says elsewhere in his corpus, but it's he tears apart the textual and religious foundation of what government looked like and justification for government looked like in his day. So there's no room for there's no room for a divinely determined positive law, in the sense that we would usually think about that, like do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this. He tears all of that apart, and he comes up with a series of principles on the basis of which you can derive pragmatic laws, but those laws are human products of what he takes to be correct notions of the divine and what would be ethically derivable from the divine, but not positive law. So in that sense, you can look at a book like the Theological Political Treatise as an attack on positive law. And it was received like that by a variety of anarchist thinkers. And beyond that, so moving on from his Theological Political Treatise to the ethics. So in essence, what sort of like a big picture of the ethics could look like is that human beings have direct access to the divine insofar as we understand the divine as substance. And because of that, we don't need revelation. And in fact, there's no room for revelation. From his perspective, the idea of revelation in the normative theological sense is utterly irrational, and has no place in his system. And he replaces it with intuition, which is something that all human beings are capable of. Whether we achieve it is another question. But in principle, if you are a rational being, which he takes all human beings to be, we can achieve intuition and therefore gain an intuitive relationship with the divine. So again, whereas in the Theological Political Treatise, you get basically a tearing down of the foundations of positive law. In the Ethics, you get a tearing down of the foundations of a system of religious intermediaries between man and God. There's no prophets. There's no obligatory texts. There's just human beings and their intuitive relationship with the divine. So again, it is authoritarian in the sense that the divine is absolute, and ultimately the individual in certain respect disappears into the divine. But it's also profoundly individualistic in the sense that the religious superstructure just has no place there. And again, that's something that later generations of anarchist thinkers would pick up on.
So this is Spinoza as part of like what's been called the radical enlightenment in his critique against the powers of government and the powers of the church, of religion. Spinoza is sort of the progenitor of a separation of church and faith as well, I think might fit into here. And so here, this notion of both the erasure of the individual and the empowerment of the individual, where do you see that being picked up in anarchist thought, both in secular and religious anarchist thought? Because that's a notion which is obviously quite central to a mystical metaphysic.
So I think it depends on. I guess first of all, do we want to move on to like some of the specific thinkers that I wrote about in my book? Because like the only way that I can answer that question is by drawing distinctions between specific people, because there's some that's a relevant question to, and there's some that's not really a relevant question to.
Is there a step of thought before that question? Is there something you'd like to?
So I suppose part of it would be saying that there are mystical anarchisms and mystical Jewish anarchisms, and there are Jewish anarchisms that are not necessarily mystical ones, or at least not drawing on this train of thought. So a figure like Shmuel Alexandrov, who I wrote about in my book, and I'm very familiar with his writings. There's another scholar here in Israel named Tzachi Slater, he's the expert on Shmuel Alexandrov. So if you want to learn more about him, I'm a good gateway drug, and then he's the person who'll be able to tell you everything. But I think that this negotiation between individual and the super individual is something that's relevant to Shmuel Alexandrov's thought. So he was.
Before that question, then I have two. This I should have done earlier, and I might paste this back. Can we get a running, at least heuristic definition of anarchism?
No, it's just
a family resemblance.
Okay, so family resemblance is a way of thinking which questions top-down authority. I think is sort of the best generalist picture, because there's so many. It by definition, as an anti-authoritarian movement, you have more branches and forms of anarchist thinking than any other radical movement, to the point that it's really difficult to describe it as a movement as opposed to like an intellectual context.
Yeah, it's hard to define a movement which defies top-down authoritarian leadership with a top-down definition. It seems like it might be a
right. So, like, I mean, if you ask a Marxist what makes a Marxist, it's someone that on one level or another believes that Marx's writings specifically are continue to be relevant and meaningful, and so on and so on. But anarchism isn't that, and it's not one person.
Right. Right. Another question. The way we've been sort of painting the story up until now is that we see from Spinoza these kind of two trends of anarchism emerging: one rational, one mystical, and there may be a significant overlap between the two, as you've been saying. There's another. I was just reading, just in preparation for the interview, I was reading Simon Critchley's essay on mystical anarchism, and listening to a talk that he did together with Cornel West about mystical anarchism. He actually doesn't mention Spinoza at all in his trajectory. He draws directly from Christian medieval heresies, most notably the Brethren of the Free Spirit and Marguerite Porete and other mystics of that period. And he draws his line from the Christian mystics, which has been documented by Norman Cohn in his Pursuit of the Millennia. And so I'm curious to know, just a bit of a zoomed out sketch, how much of modern anarchism do you feel is rightly drawn back to Spinoza? How much should be drawn back to medieval mystics? How much of that is just alternative sort of framings and narratives of the same story?
I think the story of the history of anarchism depends on how you tell it. So, in Kropotkin's sort of famous statement in the Encyclopedia Britannica on anarchism, he traces anarchist ideas back to Lao Tzu, to certain Greek thinkers. He traces it to medieval heresies. But he draws a distinction, which I think is an important distinction, between anti-authoritarian ideas and anarchism as a modern intellectual movement. I don't think that prior to Proudhon, you can talk about anarchism. I think that you can talk about anti-authoritarian ideas. So I think in an essay like Critchley's, he rightly points to anti-authoritarian traditions in medieval heresies, and not necessarily even heresies. I mean, they're, in a lot of respects, various Protestant groups that continue to be orthodoxies today were profoundly anti-authoritarian in their origins, and those anti-authoritarian trends become their own orthodoxies. So to trace back anti-authoritarian notions is one thing. To trace back anarchism as a train of thought that starts with Proudhon is another thing. So for me, I think that that's really important. And in my work, in the book, I make that distinction really clear, that you have in Jewish tradition a number of different anti-authoritarian ideas that go back to the earliest period of Israelite history and continue on through the Middle Ages. And they're anti-authoritarian. And then you have the people that I look at who were writing towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, who I feel justified in categorizing as anarchist thinkers because they were referencing modern developments and using the biblical, mystical, etc., ideas to articulate things that were happening in the modern world.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a very helpful distinction. Just to keep the conversation in concert with the theme of mysticism, which is the theme that underlies the channel, can you, and this might, I think these two questions may merge a little further down the line. Can you tell us briefly what mystical anarchism is?
As a general rule, like my approach to things is, I don't like to define the bigger picture. I like to look at the phenomena, and then allow someone else to draw larger conclusions. So the section of my book where I talk about mystics who were engaging in some sort of combination of anarchist politics, political ideas, and mystical ideas. So as far as I'm concerned, if you're talking about Kabbalah, you're talking about Jewish mysticism. And if you're talking about texts that were written by people who were acknowledged to be anarchists, then you're talking about anarchism. So at no point do I endeavor to define what is mysticism or what is anarchism. These are pragmatic determinations for me of in the history of ideas, there are certain people that are associated with different sets of movements. And if you're talking about those people or the books that they wrote or books that were inspired by them, etc., then you fit within this picture.
So I appreciate that approach. I'm looking specifically at Jewish authors here. These Jewish thinkers and authors that are engaging seriously with what is considered the Jewish mystical tradition and engaging simultaneously with what is considered the tradition of anarchistic thought, of anarchism. Are they thinking about these things in isolation from one another, or are they thinking about them in conversation with one another?
Some of them were aware of each other. Well, let me rephrase. The ones who were writing on specifically drawing on mystical sources were not in contact with one another. So the two people that I write about in the book were Yehuda Ashlag and Shmuel Alexandrov. They lived in different places. Shmuel Alexandrov never came to Eretz Israel, and Ashlag did, and they never refer to one another because they were never in contact and never read each other's books.
Okay, my question is a slightly different one. But I'd appreciate, this might be a good time to introduce you those two characters so that we can talk about them in a more sustained fashion. But when I'm asking in their own minds, their own brains, their thought which was engaged with mystical traditions and that thought which was engaged in anarchistic traditions, in their own thinking, were those happening in conversation with one another?
I see. I thought you were talking about the people being in contact.
No, within their hemispheres.
Yeah, for sure. They were both integrationist. They were both integrationist thinkers, where there was an assumption of a natural continuity between mysticism and ethics and politics. That it's not that you're talking about two separate spheres of concern, two separate spheres of thought. It's rather that they have metaphysical assumptions, and those metaphysical assumptions govern the way that they think about ethics and politics.
So could you tell us briefly who these two central characters are when it comes to speaking of Jewish mystical anarchism, and then go on to enlighten us about what their thinking was in relating their metaphysics and their politics and ethics?
Okay, so two of the major figures that I've written about, and I think that there's a bigger story to be told about the impact of mystical ideas on a variety of other Jewish anarchist thinkers, but it's for the others, it's going to be more peripheral. For these two, it's really central. And those are Rabbi Shmuel Alexandrov and Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag. Alexandrov is an interesting figure because he more than anyone, I think, really takes seriously this idea that I had mentioned earlier of Hakol Bo, like everything is in the Torah. And so most of his writings are actually in the context of letters that he wrote to a variety of Jewish intellectuals in his day.
Can you situate him for us historically before getting into his thought itself?
So he, again, he's a late 19th century Jewish thinker. He studied in Volozhin together with Harav Kook. And they maintain the correspondence. Some of those letters appear in collections of letters that he published later on. And in Cook's collection of letters, there's also letters that were written by Ashlag that are included in that.
By Alexandrov.
Alexandrov. So for example, a lot of discussion since Cook was alive has gone into his efforts to think about what the role of secular Jews are in the rebuilding of the Jewish nation, and sort of situating secularity as a part of a religious event.
Just very briefly for the audience, this is Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, the first chief rabbi of what at the time was the
British Mandate
Palestine.
So those ideas were formed in conversation with Alexandrov. So he's really a central figure to some of the things that Cook is most well known for. And in fact, I would say that some of the more radical things that Rabbi Cook thinks are stated in much more radical terms in Alexandrov's writings, and Cook took a much more conservative take on the same train of thought.
Right. I think just to make a point here, I think that's quite an important historical note, because many do consider Rav Cook to be today's most influential thinker, at least when it comes to the religious Zionist world. So it's not a small matter of influence if that's indeed the case.
Right. So Alexandrov was profoundly influenced by German idealism, especially by Schelling. He was an avid reader of Spinoza also, and a number of his letters discuss both of those thinkers. And for him, these are sort of like components of his broader mystical picture of the world. So I'd say the central notion for Alexandrov is this idea of absolute divine unity that encompasses all things physical and spiritual into one composite whole along vaguely Spinozist lines. But like the German idealists, so whereas for Spinoza, it's, let's say, for the sake of argument, the picture is flat. So, and what I mean by that is there's just substance and its attributes, and all of those attributes are not emanating from substance. It's all in. And substance is eternal and has no development because it's absolute. What the major contribution that the German idealists introduced was basically history. And for them, you have, say, unconscious substance that objectifies itself, and becomes conscious, but then loses track of its most essential element. And then what history is a progression back towards its most essential element, so that it can be both conscious, so both self-conscious and fully integrated with its own being. So a reunion of subject and object.
Yes.
And Alexandrov enthusiastically embraces this idea and situates it within the context of a Kabbalistic worldview along the lines of an original divine crisis, a shattering of the divine, a recombination of the divine, and then which constitutes the redemption. Yeah. So for him, these are parallel thoughts that are tremendously important for him on a metaphysical basis that are part and parcel of his view of the world from the vantage point of the absolute, in which material and spiritual are not separated. Like he talks a lot about the idea of a person operating. He speaks about the spiritual worlds of Asiya, Yitzira, Bria, and Atzilut, not as places that one goes, but as psychological conditions. And for him, a person in the world who operates within the world of Atzilut is a person for whom distinctions between physical and spiritual don't exist. So he's operating within the framework of the absolute. And where that plays out morally and politically is that he sees a possibility of a reconciliation between the individual and humanity as a whole. And he uses the word cosmopolitanism, just transliterated into Hebrew. And for him, what cosmopolitanism looks like is a non-differentiation between individual and the total collective, that you can have an individual and you can have a collective, and one doesn't impinge on the other because they're included in one another. And politically, what this looks like for him is a universalist nationalism. So another important German thinker for him is Fichte. And Fichte had this idea about German nationalism, where the Germans are the stand-in for humanity. And this later became a real problem, but judging on the side of merit of what this looks like is that you have a particular nation that embodies humanity and then spreads the idea of humanity, and such that their particularism is basically the expression of a universalism. They're the apostles of universalism, and that apostlehood constitutes their particularism. And Alexandrov takes this notion, which for him is very profoundly based in his metaphysical and Kabbalistic ideas about how the world is constructed, and applies that to Jewish peoplehood, and makes the central vocation of the Jewish people as being the apostles of humanity.
So what Fichte sees as the universal, or particularly universalism of the German, Alexandrov takes and superimposes to the Jewish nation as this the universal particular. Is he looking to what seems to be challenging in any kind of unitive, either metaphysical or politic, is that it seems like the easiest way to create a unity is by collapsing one of the particulars into the other. So you speak about the person who's in the state of what he might call an atzilot consciousness, a way of mitigating or undoing the bifurcation between spirit and matter might just look like collapsing one into the other, where matter becomes spiritualized or spirituality becomes materialized. And the same thing might happen as well when it comes to politics or morality, broadly speaking, where a universal particularism or particular universalism may, in actual effect, look like something more like a universal assimilationism or a particularistic ethnocentrism, as perhaps what happens with Fichte's thought in Nazi Germany. How does he maintain the ability to deconstruct boundaries without collapsing one into the other, both metaphysically and politically?
So I think it's easier to answer metaphysically. So number one, which I think is both theologically and historically important to understand, is that Alexandrov is coming from Chabad background. So he's very deeply steeped in Chabad thought. But not the Lubavitch branch.
Just very briefly, the audience may not know what Chabad and Lubavitch is.
Okay, sorry. So Chabad is one branch of Hasidic thought that was founded by Shneor Zalman of the Adi, and in contemporary Jewish life, Chabad is most known for its outreach efforts on campus and in a variety of other different contexts. But what is less well known is that modern Chabad movement is the outcome of one branch of what once was a much broader intellectual movement. They're Chabad Lubavitch, which is to say that they trace their spiritual lineage to the promoters of Chabad theology that settled in the city of Lubavitch eventually. But there were more Chabad branches, elements of which still exist today, but very small numbers. But once, actually, Chabad Lubavitch was the minority and the others were the majority. So Shmuel Alexandrov was a chassid of one of the other branches of Chabad that didn't really survive the Holocaust. So he's deeply rooted in this way of thinking, and one of the elements in Chabad thought, which I think is helpful in thinking through what, for him, the relationship between particular and universal looks like, is the idea of atzmut as it's developed in Chabad thought. So I'm going to draw on my reading of Ein Beit, which is a series of lectures that were given by the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe. This would have been a series that Shmuel Alexandrov did not read, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to say that these are ideas that are sort of present within many other strains of Chabad thinking.
1 second, you said Ein Beit, 7th Chabad.
Sorry, I apologize. The 5th Chabad Rebbe.
Yeah.
Thank you. So at one point, the Rebbe...
Otherwise known as the Rebbe Rashab.
The Rebbe Rashab.
So you're saying Alexandrov was writing before the Rebbe Rashab, but these ideas are percolating.
Actually, he was a contemporary. The Rebbe Rashab survived into the 20th century. Okay. Well into the 20th century. So they were contemporaries. Maybe they knew of each other. I'm not really sure, but they were of the same generation.
Right. But you're going to make theological reference to Ein Beit, albeit slightly anachronistically.
Yeah, I'm making an anachronistic reference to Ein Bet because it's not a book that Alexandrov likely read, but I think that the ideas that are expressed in there are ideas that you can find elsewhere. It just happens to be that I'm a fan of Ein Bet.
We allow our guest interviewees 3 anachronistic passes to the interview, so this is your first one.
Okay. So the Rebbe Rashab talks about Atzmut in a number of different places in this series of lectures. And one of the more profound points that he makes is about the connection between Atzmut Elokut, the essence of divinity, and blind matter. And basically what he says is that the absolute core of the divine is something which is utterly unrevealable. And for this reason, he says that there's a thematic, and in that respect for him, an actual metaphysical connection between the essence of the divine and blind matter, because blind matter is utterly devoid of evident divinity. It's just stuff. So in traditional Kabbalistic thought, that's considered to be a bad point for matter, because you have all of this divinity in the world, and then you just have plain stuff, right. And it's often associated with this source of evil. That matter and evil, being the absence of the divine, are really deeply connected in a lot of different Kabbalistic texts.
And a theme that goes back to Plotinus as well.
Exactly. But for the Rebbe Rashab, the opposite is true, that matter can be matter because the essence of God is unrevealable. So the unrevealable becomes that which is utterly unrevealed. And in that sense, the two coincide. You could describe the essence of God as blind matter. And so I think that for a thinker like Alexandrov, when he thinks about what does a human body look like, or an individual human creature, so you have its material and conscious elements, and ultimately, to the extent that they're not God, it's all reducible to matter. What makes a creature a creature and not God is that it's God as combined with a material substrate. So all of our conscious elements are material in some respect. So in this respect, that the essence of God and the essence of the material are in fact one and the same thing. It turns out that as the particular beings that we are, we're also identical with the very essence of God because we're material creatures.
So that's like a real, huge, mind dump of metaphysics there. Which is really a really fascinating theme of thought for me. Let me just rephrase it back to you so we could tease it out perhaps a bit for the audience, and then I would love to see if we can push that in the direction of its political implications. So let me see if I can sort of recapitulate back to you what you've been presenting from the Rebbe Rashab's metaphysics and how they affect Alexandrov. And particularly in response to this question of unity not being just a collapsing of one into the other, or not being a simple erasure of one side of the equation, but a unity that can somehow maintain the particularities of the things that it's trying to unite. So the Rebbe Rashab presents this notion, as you've been saying, of the blind matter, the Chaimer Galam, is that the term that he uses?
Yeah.
As that thing which is most like the essence of God which fundamentally is non-revealable. It's the etzem built in the scala, and therefore anything that is revelatory, or what we would consider spiritual, is in fact not a revelation of the essence of God, because the essence of God is that which does not reveal itself. And the only other thing in existence which has that same feature of non-revelation, of non-disclosure, is base matter, is material itself. And therefore it's this radical kind of, not a spiritual materialism, because it's actually sidestepping spirituality as fundamentally, not fundamentally divine, but instead embracing perhaps more of a deified matter than a spiritualized matter.
I think that's a good way of putting it. A way that I've thought about putting it, and I'm not wedded to this. I'm kind of iffy on it, but I've thought about it, is almost a God intoxicated atheism.
Right.
That like anything which we could recognize as being divine is by definition not divine, and in our intense thirst to seek out the divine, we have to reject all of the gods that we encounter.
Yes, which has very strong roots in many mystical theologian. We've discussed this previously on the channel, the overlap of atheism and mysticism, particularly in the case of Spinoza, who I think you're paying homage to in that reference of God-intoxicated atheism. And also it's been discussed in the context of Rev. Cook, who also works on synthesizing atheism and mysticism. But I think the same could be said for Meister Eckhart and for a dozen other mystics of every tradition. So I'm curious to know it's hard to discuss metaphysics in abstraction. I think maybe applied metaphysics is a better way of saying that. For Alexandrov, when we have this God-intoxicated atheism, this deified materialism, what does that actually mean for him? How does that change the way that he lives his own life, both religiously and ethically, and therefore politically?
So number one, it gives him a framework for thinking through the relationship between particular / individual and the universal. So going back hundreds and hundreds of years thousands of years to the ancient Greek sources, mm-hmm. You have this idea of associating matter with plurality.
Okay.
That by definition, if something is material, it's divisible. Mm-hmm. So developing that notion of matter is plural, and now we're adding, and also matter is divine because it's a revelation of the unrevealable.
Yes.
It means that the unified divine becomes at the same time a plurality, in the same way that for Spinozist notions of substance ultimately manifests itself in the modes, and the modes are particulars, but every mode is just a mode of substance. Mm-hmm. Which means that the particular and the absolute coincide with one another. And I think probably using a word like the absolute is better than using the word universal when we're talking about the metaphysical side of it. So particular and absolute coincide; they're one and the same thing.
Particular being multiplicity here.
Yeah, each instance of the multiple.
Yes. Yeah.
So for an individual human being or anything really, then you have a coincidence of this particular thing, which is matter, and its materiality as a particular, and the absolute of God, substance, and so on. A step that Alexandrov takes, which Spinoza definitely would not have taken, is that there's a national element, a possible national element for this too, that you have particular nations. You have Am Yisrael, and you have other types of nations also. And
before we go there, just to recap the last thought, the notion of a deified matter is that when the rubber hits the road, what it actually means is it's a co-identification of the particular, which has multiple instantiations, and each particular instantiation is a manifestation or whatever it is of the all, of the whole, let's say. So it's it's a notion of the all in all, or the sort of that each one represents the entire, where each mode is really some sort of a mirroring of the rest of reality. That's practically what's coming out of that metaphysic.
Yeah.
Okay. And now let's shift to nationalism in that regard.
So for Alexandrov, the same principle applies to the nation, that in its purest form, the nation is a particular instance of humanity, but insofar as it's a particular instance of humanity, it's just humanity writ small, and then there's humanity writ large, which means for him that you can have a nationalism that is both particular and universal, because the particular is just an instantiation of the universal. And in his view, it's not that Judaism or the Jews are the only possible instance of this coincidence, but he sees the national purpose of the Jewish people is to reveal this to others. So there's a certain proselytizing type quality to it, but the point is not to turn other people into Jews. It's that the way that he defines what is a Jew is the nation that represents humanity writ small.
Yeah.
So sharing the idea of humanity writ small as a part and parcel, as an instance of humanity writ large, is what becomes the national purpose of Jewish people.
Yeah. So the Jew for Alexandrov represents the archetype of this macrocosmic image of the whole, and therefore the Jew's role is to show that any nation can embody that archetype as well. I'm guessing that for him it's something which is refracted at sort of all levels of zooming in and out of reality. So the individual is probably as well, like the nation or humanity writ small, and then as like that process probably continues upward. Is that true for him?
I would say it makes sense, but he's really focusing specifically on the question of defining the character of Jewish nationalism.
And why is that so important for him?
I think that we're talking about someone who is living at the tail end of a Jewry that lived in, and a European Jewry at least, that lived in isolation from Christian society, or from Gentile society in general, where due to a variety of different causes, Jews were entering the modern world in a way that they really hadn't before, which meant entering Gentile society in a really profound way, and that was a threat to Jewish identity. And then the question is, well, what do you do about it? And I think that for him, defining the character of Jewish nationalism in a way that paid homage to a new universal spirit, and also did so in a way that wasn't damaging to Jewish solidarity, both religious and communal and national, etc., was a necessity.
Very interesting. In your close reading of Alexandrov, do you see him as primarily thinking politically, and that is influencing his religious, theological, metaphysical thinking, or is he beginning from a starting point of metaphysics, theology, and then following its implications into the political sphere? If that's at all a fair dichotomy.
I see him as primarily a religious figure, and also for him, questions of nationalism were religious questions. Sure. So, and also he wasn't an activist. Like he was an activist as an intellectual, in the sense that he contributed, like some of his major essays were published in the Hebrew periodicals of the day. So he contributed to public discourse, but he wasn't really an active member of Chovevei Tzion for most of his career, in the sense of doing things to move to Israel or build farms or whatever. He also wasn't particularly involved even on a communal scale, because he got into a number of conflicts that ended up getting him exiled from a variety of different communities. So
Was he a hard guy to get along with?
I don't know. I think Sachi Slater would be a better person to ask that. I think he would know better. I don't. My sense of it is it's not so much that he was so difficult to get along with, is that he was operating on just a very different plane than others. His marriage was not a good marriage. He was physically disabled. So there was just he went through a lot of difficult things in life. So in those difficulties resulted in him being largely isolated until towards the end of his life.
That's sounds like a hard life.
Yeah, he had a hard life.
Is it how do these thinkers reconcile what seems to be a contradiction in terms between being an orthodox thinker and between being an anarchic or anarchistic thinker?
So I think that one of the interesting things about about their projects. So, and when I say their, I mean the intellectual projects of the people who more or less operate within an orthodox framework, and those who are operating not within an orthodox framework, is that they're moving from different points of origin towards the same center point. So one of the things that I talk about in the introduction to this book is that the story of anarchist Jewish theology really starts due to the same socio-political crises that led to the rise of modern Zionism. And that in Eastern Europe, the rise of anarchist thinking in traditional Jewish community and the rise of Zionist thinking in the traditional Jewish community really were one and the same thing. So there were basically two interesting things that were happening towards the end of the 19th century. Number one, so anyone who's sort of come across Hasidic stories from the earlier period of the Hasidic movement will be very familiar with discussions of Enlightenment figures who were interfering with traditional Jewish communities and the reaction, very negative reaction that they got from those traditional Jewish communities. Yeah. So, and part of the reason for that is that many of those early Haskalah figures were essentially assimilationist in intellectual bent. They wanted to Russify or Polonify or whatever the Jewish community, and there was a lot of resistance to that because the Jewish community wanted to maintain their cultural autonomy in one form or another. So at that point, you have an enormous amount of conflict between these two different trends within the Jewish world at the time, and a basic assumption that these two things, at least in that time and in that place, were not reconcilable. Over the course of the 19th century, what you see is an enormous uptick in government-sponsored anti-Jewish violence. And the response on the part of the Maskilic community was gradual disillusionment with assimilation as a viable option for Jews to escape from cycles of violence and persecution. So when that sort of fundamental sort of existential disappointment set in, that's when you start seeing the appeal of modern Jewish nationalist movements, starting with Chovevei Zion and eventually what we now recognize as modern political Zionism. But what it also did was, when assimilationism was no longer part of the picture, what that created as an opportunity for the traditionalist community was to say, okay, well, maybe an engagement with modernity is no longer as threatening as it once was, because it doesn't necessarily mean assimilation anymore. Now it means something else. And you still have huge swaths of the Jewish community who that's still not relevant to, and until today that's still not relevant to. But it did create this possibility for some elements of the traditional community to start rethinking what Jewish modernity looks like. And one of the major centers for that was the Volozhin Yeshiva. So from the 1880s until the early 1880s until its closure in the early 1890s, it really becomes a center for Chovav Zion. And one of the major things that they're doing is trying to articulate a sense of national identity that in that context is also integrated with traditional Judaism. So some of the people that came out of that were Bialik, for example, who was essentially secularist, but there were other people who were not secularists. So, for example, Shmuel Alexandrov attended Volozhin, and he was very much involved on an intellectual basis with Chovav Zion, and articulated his views on modern Jewish theology as along anarchistic lines, and specifically in communication with anarchist sources, because in his view, this was all part of the picture.
I'm missing a link here between this sort of proto-Zionistic, hence nationalistic movement with an anarchistic movement. How's that link made? So
I think that part of the the connection between a reconciliation of Jewish enlightenment with Jewish tradition is one part of it. You're right. There's something that I missed. So that's one part of it, which is we can engage with elements of the modern world in a more meaningful way than we ever thought that we could before, because our enlighteners are no longer assimilationist, and it's less threatening. Another part of that is that on their side also, they're seeing the same things that the rest of the Jewish world is seeing, which is an enormous amount of government-sponsored violence. And so for the early Zionists, their response was, okay, well, what do we do about that? And the ultimate conclusion that most of the Zionist movement arrived at is, well, if the modern non-Jewish state is a threat to Jewish existence, then what we need is a modern Jewish state. What these groups of Jewish anarchist thinkers came to the conclusion was, well, if the modern state is a threat to Jewish existence, then the problem is the state. And if you do away with the state, then there's no longer state-sponsored violence. So it's the reconciliation with modernity and the rise of anarchist thinking are really coming from the same political and sociological sources, because both of those things happened as a result of responses to a vast increase in anti-Jewish violence in Eastern Europe.
But it seems like they're going to be either responding with nationalism or with anarchism, not both.
No, because that hinges on a distinction between what modern nationalism is. So you have thinkers like Ahad Ha'am, for example, who they formulated a cultural nationalism that really had no specific political goals. So Ahad Ha'am envisioned a formation of a Merkaz Ruchani in Eretz Israel.
Spiritual center.
Yeah, spiritual center. And that spiritual center would radiate out into the diaspora. But that wasn't really a political entity. It was a spiritual and cultural entity. It was nationalist, but it was nationalist in a cultural sense as opposed to a political sense. And this is a dispute that continued in the Zionist movement well into the 20th century as to where the emphasis of the movement's energies ought to be. Is it primarily a cultural movement, or is it primarily a political movement? Is the goal to build a homeland or a spiritual center, or is the goal to build a state? And in essence, that question was never really resolved. The way that it was resolved was by agreeing to a synthesis. And in fact, under Chaim Weizmann's leadership, they created what was called synthetic Zionism, which was a combination of cultural Zionism and political Zionism. So the resolution was to just accept that there was a tension there and bring them both under the same roof somehow. So for the Jewish religious anarchists, they were much more under the influence of Ahad Ha'am than someone, say, like Max Nordau and Herzl. So it's nationalism, but it's not political nationalism.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point you mentioned, that the response to state-sponsored violence, particularly anti-Semitic violence on behalf of the Jewish thinkers, was to try and dismantle the state, which makes an assumption that the state is the source of the violence as opposed to the people perpetuating the violence. Is there maybe like a Rousseauian assumption in the inherent goodness of the human, the human in nature, which then gets perverted or distorted by the corrupting forces and energies of the state? Is that what's happening in that thinking? Is it an overly optimistic perspective of human nature, which leads to anarchic tendencies? What do you feel is happening there?
I think it depends on the thinker. I think part of it is that if you look at the state as an instrument, we require instruments to do certain things. I can't cook soup if I don't have a pot. Like I need that tool in order to do that particular action. I can make a pancake, but I can't make soup. So I think in one respect, the assumption that they're making about the abolition of the state as an adequate response to anti-Jewish persecution and state-sponsored violence against Jews is that irrespective of human nature, whether it's good or bad, if you don't have the tools to commit state-sponsored violence, then you won't have state-sponsored violence. You may have other violence, but it's not going to be as well organized or promoted as a lot of the pogroms that came about towards the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century were. These were huge events that were largely promoted by the government. And if you didn't have a government like that, their thinking was, well, then they wouldn't have been able to push it to the extent that it was.
Interesting.
But I think that the other part is that, they were optimists. And for me, that's one of the most compelling parts of their thinking, that I think that we live in a very a cynical moment in history, and there's reasons for that. And I think that to proceed on the assumption that people are good, and therefore we can ignore the challenges to that assumption, and proceed as if nobody would do anything wrong if they had a choice, I think is a mistake. But I think that proceeding on the basis of a basic optimism about our ability and our desire to do good in the world is refreshing, and it's something that I want to see. Like I think that we require that, even if it's not true, we have to tell ourselves that it's true, because it's the only basis on which we give ourselves the strength to be able to do any good.
I'm very interested in that, and I appreciate the stepping away from perhaps a more careful historical academic discussion to something a bit more personal and maybe even aspirational. On what grounds do you hold faith and hope and optimism in human nature?
I guess on a fundamental level, I believe in the idea of like water reflects face to face, so too the human heart to another heart. And that's how I live my life. I generally feel like I try to be kind, and I don't live with any fear about the world around me in general, because I feel like I approach people from an open place, and in general, always really people respond in kind. So I have a sort of fundamentally optimistic sense about the world, and I feel like when that's lost, and when we expect others to do us harm, or expect that they have wrong intentions, it just doesn't lead anywhere good. I think even if they did have wrong intentions, if they think that I think that they have the right intentions, then they'll have the right intentions.
Is that something that's really a beautiful sentiment, and I think something which I carry and we are trying to share ultimately a positive and empowering message about humanity here through the channel. But is that something which is trying to remain critical all the same? Is that something which is bore out from your historical research, or is that something which is despite your historical research?
I think that what I would say is my historical research on the figures that I have studied bears out that they were very optimistic about human nature, and the capacity for doing good in the world. And I share that optimism. But I think one of the things that I think is lacking in the book is that the vast majority of them wrote, and they were writing prior to the Holocaust. It's really difficult to know how they would have responded to the Holocaust. So, for example, Shmuel Alexandrov died in the Nazi action in Bobroisk, and others died long before the Nazis came to power. The ones that survived the Nazis were Natan Hofshi lived until 1980, so he lived for a while. Avraham Yehudah lived into the 50s, and from his published texts, there really isn't much of an engagement with his reflections on Nazism. There's an enormous amount of unpublished material in the National Library, and for future research, I think it would be worthwhile to see if there's any unpublished essays there that discuss this question. And Yitshak Nahman Steinberg, who also survived he had left Europe before the Nazis came to power, and survived to see the aftermath of the Holocaust, and into the foundation of the State of Israel. And by the time, so the only one that I can say for sure maintained an uncompromised, of those three, the only one that maintained an uncompromised optimism was Natan Hofshi. So you see until the very last day an insistence on the possibility and the moral necessity of reconciliation with the Palestinian people, and a very critical voice that's been forgotten by the Israeli public, which I hope in future publications to address. But he basically, I think for him, theologically, the Holocaust didn't happen. It happened, and it was a tragedy, but it was a moral stain on. It was a moral stain as opposed to a challenge to his view that. So it didn't lead him to call into question his ideals.
Right.
For Steinberg, his response was really more practical. He was very concerned with the moral impact on the Jewish people by the creation of a Jewish army. And I would say in a lot of respects, some of the concerns that he raised in the early 50s about the impact of Israeli militarism were later echoed by people like Yeshayahu Leibowitz. Not to say that I think that Leibowitz was reading Steinberg. Maybe he did, I don't know. But the concerns that Leibowitz expressed are very similar to the concerns that Steinberg was expressing all the way back in the 50s. And his response to that was that he was the head of what was the remainder of the territorial organization, which for anyone watching was at a certain point a competitor to the Zionist movement that arose out of a British offer to create a Jewish homeland in what's now Kenya, but it was then called the Uganda Plan. And the territorialists said, well, the main objective is to create a place of safe refuge for Jewish refugees. This was prior to the Holocaust. So we're talking about Jewish refugees from World War I, which is another part of the story, which we don't need to get into, but it created the Eastern Front was located in the Pale of Settlement. And so the ethnic community that was almost most profoundly affected were Jews. So the territorialists said, well, maybe we'll get to Eretz Israel, but maybe we won't. But the main thing is we need a safe place for these people to go. And so they promoted this idea. And when that deal fell through, they continued on as a separate movement looking for, well, many, many, many other possible places of refuge, none of which panned out. But starting in the 30s, Steinberg became the head of that and turned it into what he called the Freeland League. And he continued pushing this idea even after the State of Israel was founded. But again, he's not really contending with whether, not on a theological or philosophical level, he's not contending with the degree to which Nazism is a stira to his, a contradiction to his ideas about libertarian socialism or anarchism, and more a practical response to what does a post-war Jewish place of refuge look like.
Yeah. Tell us about who a second mystic, anarchic thinker that you cover in your book, Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag. Tell us briefly who he is, when he's writing, where he's writing, and then we'll try and dive into some of his thoughts as well.
So Ashlag is also a late 19th, early 20th century thinker. He's best known for his commentary on the Zohar called the Sulam, and his intellectual contributions to 20th century religion probably extend beyond any other Jewish thinker, if only because from his circle emerged the what is it, the Kabbalah Institute? I can't remember what they're actually
Kabbalah
called.
Center.
The Kabbalah Center
In Hollywood.
In Hollywood, and its branches in many, many other cities. So the people that founded the Kabbalah Center came out of Ashlag's circle. So whether Ashlag would have been in favor of the Kabbalah Center is an open question, but he was definitely extremely influential, far outside of the framework of the Jewish community, strictly the Jewish community. In addition to his major work, the Sulam, which is again a commentary on the Zohar, he wrote a series of other Kabbalistic works trying to articulate sort of synthetic view of what Kabbalah is about as a whole. And he basically gave a profoundly ethical picture of what the meaning of Kabbalah is that permeates all of his other writings. So in his commentaries on the Zohar, for example, he'll tell you what the text means, but it's based on a really profoundly ethical notion of what God is up to in the world. And that basically is that God is a beneficent being who wishes to do good, and creation is an extension of God's beneficence. And in order for God to be able to be beneficent, there has to be a recipient, someone to receive his beneficence. But if beneficence is giving, then and that's good, then the thing that receives falls into the category of bad in some way. So what Ashlag's system, the fundamental architecture of Ashlag's system is almost a Manichaean, that's not really fair, but a conflict between forces of giving and forces of receiving. And to a certain extent, this is inescapable. Human beings, in order to exist as human beings, and any other creature for that matter, has to receive. You can't be and not get. So there's an inescapable characteristic of this badness of receiving that is part and parcel of being a human being. But what the function of mystical practice, and for him that includes the observance of mitzvot and the study of Torah, is to emulate, to do Amat Yodeh, to imitate God, which means to become beneficent beings. And to the extent that we realize, the extent to which we realize ourselves as beneficent beings is the same extent to which we achieve what he calls devekut, which is a concept that has a long history in Hasidic and Kabbalistic thought. But for him, devekut is a fundamentally ethical, mystical event. We get to a state of devekut, of mystical connection to God, by dint of moral actions that we do in this world, which makes us similar to God. Because for him, similarity equals connection. If you're the same as something, then you are identical with that thing. So by imitating God, we become identical to God to some extent, and this is what he calls devekut.
If you could just flesh out one point there, which I feel may do with a bit more words, what is the relationship between ethical behavior and the act of giving, as you phrased it?
So when I'm saying ethical behavior, what I mean is actions that are morally charged, that we could describe as either good or bad. And if I can describe Ashlag's worldview in like a general sense, the baseline characteristic of what enables us to describe something as good is if it involves an act of giving in some sense. And so we are when I say that ethical behavior becomes mystical behavior, what I'm saying is that the act of giving makes one similar to God as a beneficent being, and by dint of that, by dint of being similar to God, we're identical to God, and by being identical, there's a sort of leap from the ethical to the ontological, that we actually are connected to God.
What does giving mean for him in a ethical context? Because giving in a metaphysical context simply means that God is the one that emanates being from God's self. What does it mean to give ethically, or what is the assumption of the association of giving and whatever the word would be, ethicality?
Well, I mean, I think so. We're forced to step over boundaries. So there's a tendency to, I mean, and it makes sense to make a distinction between ontology, the study of being, and ethics, study of action. But in the context of God bestowing being on creatures, what we're talking about is God is the possessor of being, and then God imparts being on other things. So that there's an action there. So it's ontological in a sense, but we're incapable of discussing that ontological relationship without talking about deeds. God does something, and that something that he does is an act of giving being.
And how do we human beings do that?
And so I think that for Ashlag, the what God is giving is less important than that God is giving rather. So God gives being, and we give other things. We give tzedakah, we pray, and in a sense, we're giving of our consciousness. All of the mitzvot, in some sense, can be defined in one manner or another as an act of giving something. And so for him, the specific object being passed is less important than the fact that it's being passed.
Right. So I'm not as familiar with Ashlagian metaphysics as I might be with, let's say, the Rashav, because I didn't grow up in an Ashlag community. So for my own personal interest, this notion of positing recipienthood with some sort of malevolence or evil or fallenness, and givingness with some sort of benevolence or divinity or positivity, seems to be a curious association for me, because firstly, in every act of giving there is receiving too. When it comes to the mitzvah of tzedakah, charity, for example, there's a mitzvah both upon the giver of the charity to give, and there's a mitzvah upon the person who needs the charity to receive as well. And without the capacity for reception, there will be no capacity to give. They're like two sides of the same coin. In conversation, we receive when we open an ear to another person, which I think is an ethical act. As much as we're giving attention, to me it seems almost impossible to isolate the act of giving from receiving. And I see it, I don't know why we would assume that reception means negativity, unless reception for him means lack, which is there's, for him that's a negative aspect. If that's something for my own knowledge, if you could.
Well, so I think that since we've jumped back to ancient Greek metaphysics a bunch of times, I mean that's in essence that's what when we talk about like a Neoplatonic vision of the world. You have the divine emanator, and then at the very bottom of that system, something that it's emanating onto, and that bottom of the system is the source of evil, because it's not emanating. It's not. It's the necessary condition for it's the context of emanation.
So
but
it's evil insofar as it's a privation of being.
yeah,
So it's because it's in a position where it is receiving. That is because it's lacking. It's lacking the one or the divine or the good, and therefore it's evil.
right. So I think that the difference between the Neoplatonic picture and the Ashlagian picture is that by using the language of giving and receiving in the ethical sense that he's using it, it's really blurring the difference between the ontology of a vessel and the moral substance of someone that takes or something that takes. So he's really talking about giving and receiving, not just a privation of being that is at the bottom of a Neoplatonic picture of the universe.
Right. So what does that mean for him in terms of his actual applied ethics and applied politics? I mean, Ashlag is being labeled all kinds of things, from like a socialist to a communist. And I'm curious to know, from having studied him, where does the metaphysics hit the road here again?
So I think that he never identifies himself as an anarchist, for example, nor does he identify himself as a communist or a socialist specifically. What he does do is, in his political and ethical essays, is engage in an extended critique of Soviet communism. And his take on it is that, in essence, the communist idea is a good one, because what does it involve? It involves giving. You want everyone to have what they need, to each according to their need, from each according to their ability, which, by the way, is a pre-communist notion that has its origins in anarchism, but whatever. So for him, that's a profoundly beautiful idea. But he saw what happened in Soviet Russia and felt the need to explain that theologically, and to say, well, what happened there that, in spite of the fact that they were motivated by beautiful ideas, they didn't get beautiful results. And his answer to that is drawing on his metaphysics, which is that people have to have internal motivation. And for him, that internal motivation is a spiritual and a religious and a mystical motivation that we're all trying to achieve dveikut. And the way for him that we get it is through giving. So we can give through normative mitzvot, wearing tefillin, whatever, and giving tzedakah, and on a social and political context, that's the distribution of goods. We share with one another our goods. His problem with the Soviet model was that it was forced from above, and because it was forced, it meant that it missed the motivational element. It just said, now we're all going to give, and didn't address the existential element of people have to want to give.
Why?
And so for him, from a political standpoint or a social economic standpoint, the function of his view of Kabbalah is to provide the motivational underpinning to make people become the sort of person that can be a communist, as opposed to saying, well, now you live in Soviet Russia, therefore you're a communist. Right. And so that's why I believe that he was an anarchist in the sense of being a libertarian socialist, because he believed in this equal distribution of goods, but he disbelieved in the possibility of that being successful by means of external force. It had to come from it had to have an inner motivation.
So in him repudiating the authoritarian and coercive elements of Russian communism, you see an anarchistic element in his thinking. Does he see this Kabbalistic raison d'etre of communism as a universally applicable idea, which he wants the whole world to come and become Kabbalist metaphysicians, or at least be inspired by the metaphysics of Kabbalah and therefore go and act ethically? Or is he addressing specifically the Jewish community? What's his? If we can sort of come back to the conversation we began earlier of nationalism and universalism, how's he seeing that?
I think he was a spiritual nationalist, in the sense that he believed that there is a such thing as the Jewish people, and he believed that the Jewish people have a purpose in the world, and for him that purpose was expressed in the idea of arivut. So the idea of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bazeh, all of Israel is responsible for one another or mixed together with one another. And so for him, what Jewish political action looks like is achieving comprehensive arivut, comprehensive mutual responsibility, and mutual support, solidarity, whatever word you want to use, that has both religious and economic and political elements, and then that becoming a model for the rest of the world.
As a model for the rest of the world to follow suit. I'm curious about contemporary manifestations of Ashlagian thought. You mentioned the Kabbalah Center, but I also know in northern Israel there's a community, or Haganuz, which identifies as an Ashlagian community. I'm curious if you could speak at all to contemporary manifestations of Ashlagian politics, economics.
I'm really not equipped to. I know of Organuz, but I've never met anyone that lives there or spoken to them, so I don't know. As far as the Kabbalah Center, I think an aspect of it which is unfortunate is that it's a commodification of Ashlagian thought, which I think really runs counter to this vision of what essentially amounts to religious anarcho-socialism, libertarian socialism, whatever. But they're selling religion as a commodity, as opposed to using religion as a tool for overcoming commodification.
I hear that. Those are really two fascinating thinkers, and I think that there's a lot of depth and richness in their thought, and I think the work of unearthing and resurrecting these thinkers and bringing a critical analysis to them is a real service to contemporary religious thought in general, and specifically to anarchic, communistic. There was a specific term used, anarcho-socialist. What was the term used?
I used the term libertarian socialism, but the reason why I'm using that is because it was really it was used as a synonym for anarchism for a long time. Because for example, there are American thinkers, why am I blanking on the name? Doesn't matter. There are American economists that identify themselves as anarcho-capitalists, and they're really strongly identified with the libertarian right. So to the extent that they are anti-authoritarian, it is arguable that they're inspired by anarchist ideas, but what they don't have a problem with is economic hierarchies. So they're fine with some people being extraordinarily wealthy and therefore more powerful than others. But what they don't like is top-down rules that govern who gets to become extraordinarily wealthy. So I think the vast majority of people that are at all familiar with the history of anarchist thought would be very, very hard pressed to define that as a trend of anarchism.
Right.
But it is anti-authoritarian in some sense.
Right. This is actually this conversation is very interesting for me because it's quite a strong divergent from what I usually do on the channel. I, on principle, don't talk any politics on the channel, both because it doesn't interest me so much and I don't know about it as much as I do other topics, and I find politics to be divisive in nature, and I'm trying to. This is a project about unity, not divisiveness, but for some reason, I am interested in, as very much an outsider and not well read at all. I'm interested in the overlap between mysticism and anarchism, and mysticism and communism, mysticism and utopianism, and messianism, and sort of that full cluster and bundle of ideas, which sort of what's what I'm looking for? Which like orbit around each other. I read through some of Norman Cohn's Pursuit of the Millennium not too long ago, and he makes a very interesting direct link between we spoke earlier about the anarchistic elements of the medieval Christian heresies and even some non-heresies like forms of Protestantism. What he makes is this connection between forms of communism and mysticism, where there's this notion amongst the mystics who do take a very optimistic view of human nature, despite elements of original sin in Christian theology amongst the Christian mystics, but because they believe in the possibility for a deification of the self, a notion that exists in Christian orthodoxy in the East and exists also in forms of the Christian West, and I think in Jewish mysticism too, and other traditions. Islam could be included there quite easily, where if the Spirit of God is inherently inside the individual, and then there's a path by which the human can become a full manifestation of God, can become deified, then there's the possibility for a return to the Adamic state pre the fall in the Garden of Eden, which sort of circumvents the original sin problem for Christian theology. And in that state, it's a paradisical state where everything is shared in freedom, and labor itself becomes not an end in itself, because there's no interest in greed and accumulation and avarice. And I think you see this all the way from those Christian mystics who are hoping to build these utopian communities, which do away with notions of possession and ownership, which are predicated on a metaphysics of a separate identity. And once the separate identity is annihilated, like possession and ownership goes away with that pretty quickly. A basic feature of communistic thought, I think, as well. And I think you see this even with contemporary, or modern rather, economists like John Maynard Keynes, who speaks about in his famous essay, The Economic Possibility of Our Grandchildren, about how we can reach a day and age where there's so much plenty and bounty that we'll have to learn how to stop worrying about production and consumption, all things we've been trained to think, and the wisest will be those who spend their day idly in positively pursuing other means of occupation or entertainment. I think reflected in Maimonides as well. He speaks about the Messianic age as one where there's no other interest other than to contemplate the majesty of God, the glory of God. So I see this sort of trend of thinking, this overlap between a utopian communism and a sort of messianic mysticism. And this is all me just reading as an outsider and just seeing these themes. I'm curious if you could address that. This is not a specific question. If you could address that cluster, that orbit of ideas, and how you perhaps see that manifesting in the characters you've been analyzing, or even in your own thought, and in the possibilities that we have today as humans, moving, towards the what some see as the end of the planet, and what some see as perhaps the end of existence as we know it.
So I think that there's two ways to look at that, and the way that cuts for me, I think, is probably what I do with all of the things that I'm reading and writing about. and how I think about what good they might do, and how the people who I'm writing about thought about these questions. So I think that all of them were messianists in their own ways. Some, but they didn't all have the same sort of messianism. So I would say that for a figure like Alexandrov, he has a number of discussions of a restorationist type of, or let's say a transcendent restorationism vision of the messianic, where humanity passes through, and spirit in general passes through a series of historical stages of externalization, and then returns to an original Adamic state that's better than it was before, because it's both objective and subjective. So, and obviously for him, that involves all of the other political and moral implications of that integration of objective and subjective that we discussed already. So for him, that's a big circle of proceeding and then returning. I think that for a lot of the others, the messianic element was much more progressive. That they were profoundly idealistic in the way that they looked at the world. And what I mean by idealistic isn't just in the sort of general sense of like having ideals, but in the sense that they looked at, they believed that there had to be some sort of absolutely good moral vision towards which the world was progressing, and that would guide having a horizon, having a beautiful horizon to move towards is what gets the world moving in the direction. Whether it reaches there or not is another question. But the idea of the fundamental importance of an absolute ideal, and for them that absolute ideal is represented, broadly speaking, as the messianic, or a messiah, or a messianic age, or something like that. And they articulate it in different ways, but I would say, with the exception of Alexandrov, who has this restorationist circular view, they're all looking at it as a linear form. For me, so one of the things we touched on earlier is the fact that the vast majority of the people that I've written on all died either during or before the Holocaust. And the ones that survived didn't really address the theological crisis that represented for the vast majority of world Jewry, and especially for intellectually engaged Jews of the 20th century. And because of that, there is less of an engagement with some of the challenges that these ideals that they're articulating throw in the path of the course that Jewish history took after the war. So Jewish sovereignty is a real thing now. Jews have power. Jews have land. Jews have citizenship. Like, we are part of the world in a way that we never really were before. And part of what they did, not all of them, but let's say, for example, a guy like Aaron Shmuel Tamaret, which we haven't discussed because he wasn't a mystic, but he had a very anti-territorial view of Jewish, modern Jewish politics, let's say. And he wasn't alone. So they idealized the idea of powerlessness as a model to be promoted. that power, instead of powerlessness being a problem, powerlessness becomes an ideal. That everyone should be without power because power is bad, and that's an attractive notion, but it's not a notion that exists that is true of the Jewish community in the world that we now live in. It was true of the Jewish community prior to the Holocaust, that the vast majority of Jews in the world were not citizens of any state. They were stateless peoples. There were stateless people that happened to be located somewhere. So the reality of lack of Jewish power made sense to talk about in the context of somehow idealizing it and turning it into a political force. So then for me, like, the question is, okay, well, what do we do with that in a world where that's not the Jewish people that I've known, and it's not the Jewish people that almost anybody alive today has known. So I think that where Messianism plays in what I do with these ideas is what's called critical utopianism. And the idea is that, so traditional utopianism is just, okay, well, you have this grand notion, let's talk about Atlantis, and all of the great structures of Atlantis, right? But the problem with it is that it's fundamentally it's a totalitarian notion, right? And it doesn't really help us get anywhere unless we're willing to force the world into the form that we've created for what utopia looks like. But on the other hand, we can't abandon the ideal, because if we abandon the ideal, then we're just cynics, and that's no good for anybody. So there's a story by Cynthia Wozniak, which I read when I was in like 7th grade, and it's never left me. I love it. Called the Ones Who Leave Omalas. And basically the premise of the story is that Omalas is a great place. It's a utopia. Everyone's happy, blah, blah, blah. But there's one problem, which is in the basement of one of the buildings, there's a child who lives in abject poverty. Like, just like anything disgusting that you can think of, that's this child's condition. And if you want to stay in Omalas, you have to, once in your life, like as a point of transition, go into the basement and look at the child, and you're told that child isn't going anywhere. So you can have the utopia, but you need to know that kid is there, and then you have a choice. You can stay or you can leave. So the idea is you have utopia, and then you have the acknowledgement of the problems with utopia, and you have to you have to find a way of coming to terms with it in a meaningful way. And I don't actually agree with the premise of the story that the options are either staying or leaving. I think that the other alternative is to, I don't know, get the kid out of the basement, which, according to the rules of that story, would call an end to the utopia, but it would still be better. So I think that we have to have utopian messianic ideas that motivate movement forward, and we have to also acknowledge that realizing those ideas in their totality in the world that we live in is catastrophic, which is why, like, Second Temple Judaism has all of these images of the apocalypse. The Messiah is apocalyptic. It's a destructive picture. It's also a creative picture, but those two things are both true. You can't have one without the other. And so I look at the ideals that these theological anarchists are as creating is painting the ideal, and then we have the world that we live in. We have the challenges that we live with, both moral and material, political, whatever. And our job is to continue to push in the direction of the messianic ideal.
So you think it is possible to have utopia without without the child in the basement with the...
No, I don't think it's. I think that there's an inevitable amount. There's force that's involved in realizing utopia. There's destruction. So I'm not a utopian in the sense that I am looking forward to the realization of any one ideal, because I don't see that as something that can happen in a world in which human beings actually exist without a lot of violence.
And you're not advocating for violence.
No.
Okay.
What I do think is that with a view towards the utopian, it gives us a model to make tikkunim. I believe in tikkun. I don't believe that tikkun has an end point.
Mind translating?
I believe in fixing and improving. I don't think that there's an end point to the process of fixing. I think that that's an ongoing process, and that the horizon is always moving forward. We'll get to a horizon that we saw 20 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. But once we're there, the horizon will be another 100, 200, 300 years away.
Right. It sounds reminiscent somewhat of Walter Benjamin's Messiah, that never comes or only comes when he's no longer needed. I think this might be a nice sort of wrap up to the conversation. I'm curious, just before wrapping things up, those thinkers like your Walter Benjamins, your Gustav Landau's, your sort of this secular messianic thinkers, do they play into your study at all or into your thinking?
They play into the extent that I have used them to help frame some of the things that the figures that I have written about have said, because I do think that thematically a lot of them were thinking along similar lines, even though they weren't in contact. But I feel like Walter Benjamin and Gustav Landauer have been colonized by the Gentile world. And even though they were Jews and they were thinking Jewish thoughts, especially Benjamin, they've been claimed. And I'm kind of interested in doing my part within our own tchum, to look at marginal thinkers and our own parameters, to look at marginal thinkers and marginal ideas that we can lay claim to, and therefore have some sense of responsibility to respond to. I think that I would be hard pressed to feel beholden to Benjamin, even though I'm inspired by his ideas, but I don't claim him for my own. He already belongs to somebody else. Whereas a guy like Avraham Yehudah Hen or Yehuda Ashlag or Alexandrov, they were Jews first and members of the world second, and I feel responsible to answer to them.
Interesting. That's a beautiful notion. I want to end with one final question. And first, thank you for being so generous with your time and knowledge and, dare I say, wisdom. The last question is, and this is going to be a very small, easy question, don't worry. What can you, what can people in the audience that are engaging and participating really in this conversation, what can we do to move the world in a more messianic direction? That's the question.
Unconnected to the texts I'm reading, I think that we need to be radically open to other people. I think that there's a lot of walls that we build that make it very difficult to hear what other people are saying, because they're threatening. And I think that the people saying them are also having their own walls, which is why the things that they say sound threatening. And I think that when we can just meet one another as bearers of wisdom and experience, then there's room for egoless, or at least ego-reduced conversation that bears insight. It's what I think makes things better.
Even if the conversation takes place in the overstructures of commodification and spectification.
I don't think it does. I think when you open yourself to hear what someone else is saying, and the other person speaks to you as an open person and not as an example or an instance of some other thing or person, but just the one with ears, then I don't see there isn't a commodity there. It's just two souls that are merging.
Words from the heart, which enter the heart.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. One last question. If people want to find your work, either in print or online, what's the best? I usually publish at the end of the conversation, but the assumption that someone made it all the way to the end, they're really interested in what you have to say. So where are you best found?
You can find, if you search No Masters But God, Portraits of Anarcho-Judaism, the first result that will come up is a link to the Manchester University Press website, because they're the publisher of the book. So that is that's my main work, where all of the material for this discussion is coming from. So a person can read more on that. If someone goes to Google Scholar and searches Reason's Rebellion, Anarchism out of the Sources of Spinozism, they will find a PDF or access to a PDF of my dissertation. But I am giving the caveat that it is requiring a lot of work in order to become something that is good.
Got it. That's very cool. As you know, we're here at the channel founded Spinoza as well. I think you may have seen some of the work we did on Spinoza, so that's definitely. Is there anything that you would like to have said that you felt that was missed, or any final word, anything else?
I think that for Jewish life, an interesting direction the conversation could have taken, and maybe a future conversation would be coming back to a question that you kind of you kind of asked, and then we somehow got sidetracked on how do you reconcile anarchism with traditional Judaism, which involves mitzvot, which are commands.
Yes.
And so there were in the texts that I've worked with and the figures that I've studied, they've responded to that question in a number of different interesting ways that I think would be a worthwhile conversation on its own.
Interesting. The question of anarchism versus heteronomy. I know within Chabad thought, there's like ways that Chabad thinkers play on the Talmudic line of mitzvot b'telach la'tilavot, that in the Messianic age there is no commandments, and they read that mystically. Is that where the thought generally goes?
So Alexandrov, yes, but others, no.
Interesting. Maybe we will hold that. I feel like it's a new. Also, my audience isn't particularly Jewish. I mean, there is obviously a Jewish component to it. So I try. I mean, the things that we're discussing, I'm also thinking about performatively here. I try not make it too particularistic, but I try to have it embedded in a form of particularism. Like, I don't hide the fact that I'm a Hasidic Jew. I'm very proud of it, but it's supposed to be a particularism which serves universalism. So
Right.
if I can find a way that like that question is relevant to a Buddhist, a Catholic, an atheistic audience, which it very well may be, but it's definitely worth thinking about.
Okay.
All right. Wow, I feel like we covered a tremendous amount there, like, and all the way from like the heights of like historical critical thinking and academia, all the way down to like the lows of human reality, back to the highs of human potentiality. That was quite a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing what you do with it. A lot of them were Chabadniks, by the way.
A lot of the Jewish anarchist thinkers.
Yeah, so Shmuel Alexandrov was a Chabadnik. Yehuda Leyb Don-Yahiya was a Chabadnik. Avraham Yehudah Hen was a Chabadnik.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm curious to know. Did you choose them because of your own interest in Chabad, or does it happen to be a lot of?
It just happens to be a lot of
anarchists?
Chabad
Interesting.
anarchists.
I'd be curious to know why. I'm just going to share.
So I've always been interested in anarchism as an idea since high school. I read Emma Goldman's autobiography and some of her major essays and things like that when I was in high school, and it's always been an underlying interest and attraction of mine. So I started doing background research connected to the project that I'm working on now already. Really it started when I was still at YU, and continued through the time that I was at Boston College. But it didn't really occur to me that I could write my dissertation on it. So some of the sort of the questioning that I was doing in YU, so ethics, mysticism, self-negation, and because self-negation, a certain sense of divine immanence, led me to become very interested in Spinoza. And I ended up writing my dissertation on Spinoza.
Sweet.